Okay, so this is our Ruyer reading group, reading Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. We are picking up from the beginning of chapter 4. So this is page 73 of the translation. So just to give like a sort of quick recap of chapter 3. So chapter 3 was about this concept of the axiological space, and space here is in quotation marks because this is something intrinsically non-spatial. So he looks at his primary sort of starting point here is Gestalt theory and people like Kurt Lewin, who had proposed something like a behavioral field, so that like when you're studying the behavior of an organism, you have to look at it as you have to look at the organism as not just sort of in an environment made up of objects that have like a certain physical distance from it and layout and so on, but you have to understand it's the environment of the organism as this kind of field of dynamic tensions that like certain directions or certain points in this environment have a sort of attractive power and others have a kind of repulsive power. So like the sort of simple examples we've been talking about is like you're sitting at your desk and you have a coffee cup in front of you, and then there's this sort of gradient of reduction of tension as you sort of move your arm towards the coffee cup. As you pick it up and move it towards your mouth, you're sort of following a path of minimizing tension. You have like a coffee drinking tension in this behavioral field that you minimize by picking up the coffee cup and drinking from it. This is obviously a fairly trivial example, but the idea here is that you're explaining the behavior of an organism, in this case a human being, not just in terms of these like sort of objective, physically measurable aspects of the environment, like temperature, frequencies of light, and so on, but in terms of this sort of intrinsically dynamic behavioral field. So it's a sort of attractive and repulsive field that the organism is responding to, and Fourier takes this to be a sort of provisional measure, or like not going far enough. He thinks that this is, correct as far as it goes, that organisms are responding to these kinds of attractive and repulsive dynamics in their environment. But he points out that this already kind of presupposes a certain orientation of the organism towards values, what he calls values. So in the case of the coffee cup, it's only because you have this like coffee drinking tension in yourself, in your sort of state or set or whatever you want to call it, that the coffee cup has an attractive potential. Whereas if you hate coffee, or you are like you've taken a vow to abstain from coffee, or you're trying some new like diet where you don't drink coffee, whatever it is, maybe that coffee will have a repulsive force instead, that you would actually like push the coffee cup away from you. And in general, like whatever the action is in a particular environmental setting, in a particular dynamic field, it's only in relation to some sort of prior orientation that any element of that environment has a repulsive or attractive force or power, that like you can't just sort of read off from examining the organism and examining its environment whether it will want to do something, whether it will be attracted to something or be repelled from it. So yeah, there's like kind of priority of this orientation towards values. It's prior. You have to sort of understand that orientation towards values first before you can analyze how an organism will sort of implement those values by following these gradients of tension in this dynamic behavioral field. And yeah, so this sort of value space in quotation marks again, because it's not something that is present in the environment, in the spatial layout of the world around the organism. This is sort of prior, and then he sometimes uses the term schematism. There's a kind of like transfer from this non-spatial realm of values into the spatial world, and this is precisely what we're doing when we behave in a certain way, when we try to achieve a certain goal. And he also points out that this kind of non-spatial orientation, this orientation towards values, is kind of is kind of what's behind a misconception uh, that would depict goals as being psychological in the sense that you would have like a say like a mental image in your mind of what your goal is, or you would have like a proposition that you are entertaining in your mind of like this is my goal. Um, so if you are I don't know, painting a picture, you might have like a representation, a mental image in your mind of what the completed picture should look like. But this mental image is in itself sort of causally inert. It has no force to bring about the resulting painting on the canvas, except insofar as the organism, you, the painter, um, are oriented towards some value of producing a painting. And the sort of I guess illustration of this that I sort of pointed to last week is that you can suppose some sort of bizarre like telepathy instance where some random other person on the other side of the world, suddenly has this mental image, appear in their mind. You as the painter are sitting there picturing this is what my completed painting will look like, and then some random other person has this image of the completed painting. But for that other person, that image would have no sort of attractive force, or it would not sort of draw that person to produce that painting. It would just be this weird image that appears in their mind out of nowhere. And they would probably just be confused and not really understand what's going on. So this, the image or the psychological entity that is actually occurrent, that has a sort of presence in a certain moment within my actual mental life, this entity is not can't be identified with the goal of my action. It may be that I orient my action towards this goal, towards this ideal, only by means of a mental representation of some kind. But you can't identify these two sort of different types of entity, an ideal goal or an ideal value in this value space, and the occurrent actual psychological representation of that ideal. And he thinks that a lot of sort of psychological explanation commits a kind of paralogism by identifying these two entities, that like you treat something as both an occurrent psychological state and as the goal of an action, and whereas these are actually incompatible properties, that something cannot be both an occurrent psychological state and an ideal value in value space. So I think that's an important distinction that he makes, and an important sort of criticism of like psychological explanations of behavior, or psychologism in general. We can agree or disagree with the sort of morals that he draws from that distinction, but I think it's an important criticism that he's introducing here. Right, and so chapter 4 has the very general title communication, but we'll see as we go along what exactly he's going to talk about in terms of communication. But just as a sort of preliminary note, I'll just mention that of course the book is about information, and the whole sort of mathematical theory of information has to do with communication. That you have one transmitting end of a communicative process, and you have a receiving end, and then the whole field is sort of dedicated to studying what properties this communicative process has to have for that message from the transmitting end to be received at the receiving end. Like what is the sort of alphabet of symbols you have to have? How much noise can the channel, the communicative process include without sort of making the message irretrievably distorted, etc. And so this measure of information, that is sort of the basic concept of information theory, is a measure of the capacity to reconstruct the message as it was at the transmitting end when you're at the receiving end. Okay, yeah, so let's dive into chapter 4. Someone would like to read from the top?
I can read. Chapter 4, Communication. Communication between two people, A and B, that is, the transmission of information to the other, operates according to a schema completely analogous to that of the action of an individual A, aiming at an end and using a subordinate. If A wants to communicate to B an idea that he just had, he expresses it with a phrase. If he is neither mute nor aphasic, a phrase that is manifest physically in modulated airwaves and in a series of electrical waves if he uses the tone. These series of waves are retransformed to meaningful themes by if he is neither deaf nor agnosic, and finally these meaningful themes again become A's and B. As it is a matter of two conscious centers and not of a conscious center and an idea, the symmetry between 1 and 4, 1A and 3A, 2 and 3 is even more perfect than in the schema of a simple activity, and the whole is easily reversible. Communication machines are mechanically reversible. The telephone, the 3-electrode lamp, and the apparatus of phonographic recording can emit as well as receive signals at the price of minor modifications. The biophysiological apparatus of the head of a human is equally reversible, according to a mode that it is difficult to conceive as mechanical. It can transform an idea into expressive themes and words in order to express itself, and it can transform words or themes into ideas in order to understand. The root of understanding is not exactly of expression. It passes by the ear and the sensories, not by the larynx and the motors, but the quote-unquote meaningful themes and the quote-unquote understood themes as psychic reality are isomorphic, and they sometimes model themselves directly by analogical suggestion. There was figure 4.1, which has line dividing halves, each with the numbered sections going A's idea through expressive themes, a telephone emitter, telephone receiver, understood themes, and finally A's idea. As to the finally understood idea, it is not only analogically quote unquote the same as the expressed idea, it is absolutely the same idea, which is spiritual, save for psychic perturbations. And it would be absurd to speak mechanical reversibility in its subject. The individuation of the idea in the psyches of A and B must not mislead us. It remains essentially a single and same. If the spiritual quote unquote I of A and B, in opposition to their psychic quote unquote, are not like the idea absolutely one, they at least tend toward, and they would doubtless attain it if they were purely spiritual. This at least is the dream of all mystics beyond all text. And the mystic is right, because without the ideal identity quote unquote I and ideas, no communication technique would be possible, just as without quote unquote temporal survey and the relative eternity of the quote unquote I, no technique of action would be conceivable. In the case of communication as of action, the axis of symmetry, the entire system actuates here and now of a framed. If the speech acts of A are recorded on disk, a time of variable duration can insert itself in this quote unquote present. The structural inertia of the disk, probably like inertia in certainly implies a very complex, not very simple relation to space-time, but this complexity changes nothing. There exists an intermediary case between individual action and that of mnemic self-consultation. If I have an idea, I quote unquote entrust it to my memory, and sometimes I make some summary notes to help me retrieve it. Next, I consult myself with the help of the notes if needed, and if all goes well, I retrieve the quote unquote same idea. The inertia of the manuscript notes, or mechanical or magnetic recordings, and the maintenance of some psychic sets that constitute the psychobiological part of the memory, which is certainly of a nature entirely different to mechanical inertia, make a bridge between the idea first invented, retrieved idea, quote unquote I and quote I. Naturally, positivist or mechanist psychology, particularly psychology inspired by cybernetics, treats the problem of communication exactly like it treats the problem of action. It exclusively considers the intermediary framed part of and claims that the framing part as being of the same nature. In the same way that it reduces action to the functioning of feedback, it reduces communication between consciousnesses to a structured transmission, going from an element A to an element of the receiver. At the limit, one can consider material transport as a form of communication, even though in general, communication is transport of information. According to cybernetics, there is no more reason to make consciousness enter into the theory of communication, the theory of information. Communication does not necessarily take place from person to person. It can be from machine to machine, or from one part of machine to another part. Suppose that a meteorological station, A, records hourly the temperature, barometric pressure, and wind speed, and that a caretaker telephones the recorded data to a station. If the situation of the caretaker in station A becomes too uncomfortable, we can very well replace him by an automaton who will communicate via electrical transmission with station B. Suppose that the station is tasked with using the information received to guide airplanes via radio. Once again, an automaton could replace personnel there. The airplanes themselves will one day be able to fly without a pilot. If we speak of information and communication when there are workers at the stations or pilots on the airplanes, we do not see why it would become illegitimate to do so again when the workers have been replaced by automata. What is advantageously replaceable in a system cannot be the essential part of the system. I'll just read the next short paragraphs. This thesis is unacceptable in the case of communication as it is in the case of action. It is quite evident that the only irreplaceables are, on the contrary, the subjects who act, exchange messages, and oversee their various technologies. A pure transmission of informing structure can only become information and communication when the quote-unquote support is the expression of a meaning conceived by a consciousness and is the occasion of a grasp of meaning by another consciousness. The spatiotemporal part of informing communication can be reduced almost to the point of evanescence. Two spiritual consciousnesses, nearly identical, even granted a physical quote-unquote I and quote-unquote you, understand each other almost without exchange of speech or signs. By an exaggeration which is the reverse of that of the mechanists, which does not prevent their descriptions of the communications of consciousness being very superior to those of the cyberneticians, the phenomenologists and existentialists, Husserl, Shaler, Hartmann, Marcel, Buber, Nadoncel, like the mystics, go to the extreme and believe we can do away with all intermediary material, even psychic, in the communication of consciousness. So, in the beginning of this chapter, when he talks about this this 1 through 4 framing and framed action sequence, he's saying this is similar to the sequences we discussed in previous chapters, with the difference that 4 is not just some external state that was intended at the beginning of the framed action, but is another consciousness. And so communication is the transmission of a kind of ideal information via some material support to another consciousness, where he argues that it's absolutely the same idea. It occurs for the receiving consciousness as for the sending consciousness. And then, just as the mechanist philosophy believed that the framing and framed action sequences, in the case of something like turning on a thermostat, are reducible to the mechanistic explanation, which is appropriate for the framed actions. The same explanatory strategy holds for communication, notwithstanding that, here there are two consciousnesses involved rather than just one consciousness about in the.
Yeah, but I think maybe a good place to start here is the his assertion that there's a sort of identity of consciousness here that so he makes a distinction here between I and me, that so I here is what he's calling spiritual, so this has to do with this axiological space, and then me is psychic, so this is a sort of entity that has a spatial temporal location, or it's hard to specify exactly, where this should be, how this should be related to physical space, but at the same time, it's the sort of flow of sensations going through a certain person's mind, or that a certain person is experiencing at a certain time, and so I think this argument that there's an identity of the idea as opposed to just a sort of similarity or analogy or something like that. I think we can connect this also to exactly. I was just going to say exactly that. Yeah, Frege talks about how when you refer to the Pythagorean theorem, you're not referring to some psychological entity in your mind, because then you would have to say my Pythagorean theorem, and then someone else would have their own Pythagorean theorem. But you can refer to the Pythagorean theorem, and then someone else can refer to the exact same ideal entity, the Pythagorean theorem, as a single entity, as opposed to a psychological representation that would be sort of similar in your mind as in someone else's mind. And so I think it's the same type of argument that he's making here, is that so when you communicate, and if everything goes well, if you succeed in communicating with this other person, and then the other person is grasping identically the same ideal structure or semantic structure as what you are expressing, and not just something similar. Something that it's not the case that there's like some representation in your mind, and then you have some sort of expression, whether it's speech or writing or whatever, that sort of brings about a similar or analogous representation in the mind of the other person. It may be that this is a sort of mechanism that is required to affect communication, but that's not what the communication itself consists in. So successful communication is an actual grasping of identically the same ideal or semantic entity on both sides of the communication. And so he's contrasting this conception with the information theory approach to communication, which treats communication between humans and communication or transmission of messages between machines as the same type of thing. So in his example, you have this weather station where this poor guy is his job is to like call the radio control tower every hour and say the barometer is reading X, the wind speed is Y, etc. And then someone has the bright idea of replacing this poor guy with an automatic transmission mechanism where you don't need a person to actually look at the barometer and speak into a telephone. You can actually just transmit the signal from the barometer directly to the radio tower. Maybe this is one of those jobs like my hero, the Spanish civil servant who spent like 5 years reading Spinoza instead of doing his work, and no one noticed. So maybe this guy was actually quite happy to sit there and just read the barometer every hour, and spend the rest of his time reading Spinoza or Proust or whatever. So this type of communication. So I think maybe the way that Ruyer would see it is that the message that you're transmitting here is itself sort of mechanical in nature. That like you as the person looking at the barometer are just sort of receiving information in a passive way from this instrument, and so it's kind of already packaged as something sort of replaceable by a machine in the sense that you can just cut out the middleman. Instead of having a person look at the barometer and then transmit the message, you can just take the barometer reading and transmit it directly. Whereas if you wanted someone to describe the vibe in at the meteorological station, like what's the general vibe right now, this is obviously not something that you can no one's invented a vibometer as far as I know that could just sort of measure what the vibe is and transmit it automatically without human intervention back to the central vibe station that aggregates the vibes in all the different parts of the country. Obviously I'm not being too serious about this, but in general there's like anything that requires a kind of what we would call sort of judgment or interpretation, these more sort of human elements of the situation, and then transmitting it, or if we were to assign someone to write a poem every hour and send it back to the control station. Of course, you can get ChatGPT to write a mediocre poem, but it's basically just a sort of pastiche of like existing poems. But yeah, something that requires invention or creativity or judgment, these sort of more obscure human capacities would not be replaceable by a machine, at least in the same way. So in the sort of meteorological station example that he gives here, the human is already sort of performing a machine-like function, and it's because of that they can be replaced by the machine, and you can just sort of like you can treat the transmission of information, whether it's the person speaking into the telephone or this automatic transmission through this sort of mechanical or electronic system. You can treat them as the same because the person is already sort of playing the role of a machine. Whereas in the case where someone is actually inventing or creating something, it doesn't need to be sort of like a world-shattering invention, but is giving sort of a more creative, interpretation of a situation. In that case, the person is not replaceable by the machine in the same. Yeah, so maybe bomb sniffing dogs. I mean, in principle, you could probably develop some sort of chemical sensor machine that would detect the chemicals that are indicative of the presence of explosives. I think, to my knowledge, the technology is not there yet, or at least maybe it's not economically viable. That like to produce this kind of sensor would be so expensive, and maybe the device would be so sort of delicate and fragile that it would not be like practical. So it could just be more of a sort of economic, like in terms of cost of producing and maintaining the device kind of problem, as opposed, obviously dogs have been evolved for millions of years to, not to spontaneously break down and, to be adaptable to many environments and so on. So yeah, maybe that's sort of a practical question of whether it's actually worthwhile to, develop this system that would detect the chemicals that are sort of indicative of the presence of explosives. Maybe a slightly more sort of biologically relevant, or an example where the sort of capacity of a dog is maybe more like sort of what distinguishes a dog from a machine is maybe more salient is the use of dogs for people with epilepsy, where that in some cases you have a dog that can be trained to recognize when the person is about to have a seizure. And I don't, it's not something that I know a lot about, but I think from what I've seen, it's not actually clear exactly what it is that they're recognizing. It's just, empirically, a fact that, the dog can reliably recognize when the person is about to have a seizure. So it could be that there's like sort of micro tremors that start before the full seizure begins, and then the dog is sort of detecting these micro tremors. Or it could be maybe there's like some sort of chemical change that goes on, and the dog can like smell the difference in the sort of emissions from the skin of this person. Who knows exactly what it is, but when in the sort of minutes before a seizure, the dog can warn the person, and then they can lie down or take steps to protect themselves. And here the dog is presumably each person's sort of pre-seizure signs are going to be slightly different. You can't just sort of train a dog as like a general seizure detector. It has to learn this individual person's pre-seizure sort of appearance or what signs indicate the presence of a seizure in this individual person. So it's not just the capacity of the dog to recognize these subtle signs that we are not capable of recognizing. It's the dog's capacity to sort of flexibly adapt to an individual person and their signs of an oncoming seizure, and presumably these signs might change over time as well as a person goes through their lifespan, maybe changes medications that they're using to manage their seizures, etc. And the dog would be capable to varying degrees of adapting that, like what was a sign of a seizure is not a sign of a seizure anymore, or some new sign of a seizure has appeared as a result of these changes. So in this case, the dog, you can treat the dog as just a sort of transmission mechanism that like the person is sort of involuntarily emitting information that they're about to have a seizure. The dog, picks up that information and then transmits it back to that person in a way that the person can, recognize at the sort of awareness level, and then take steps to protect themselves. And here the dog is just sort of a transmitting mechanism, but at the same time, there's something maybe not quite mechanical about the dog in the sense that it has to sort of take in all the different potential signs that the person might be making, whether it's micro tremors or smells or whatever, and then sort of collate all these signs and interpret, yes or no, is the person about to have a seizure? So there's already something, creative in a sense, or there's something more like a judgment in this case than there is in the case of the machine that transmits the pressure readings back to the control tower. Yeah, so here again, maybe, I'm not too sure, but it may be a question of degree of, maybe some cases are more like this mechanical case of, just looking at the barometer reading and then transmitting it. Other cases maybe, have a certain degree of, inventiveness in like the case of the dog that has to, figure out whether these, observed sort of signs are indicative of an oncoming seizure. And then maybe at the other end, there's like, sort of full creativity of, writing a poem, proving a theorem, whatever it is. And then, yeah, there'd be obviously many points in between these sort of extreme ends of the spectrum. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's sort of my extrapolation here, and I don't know if Ruyer would accept that presentation. Okay, we can go on to the next bit. 61. Are you able to read today? Okay, no, yeah, no worries. I'll read this bit. The truth is that the intention of communicating from quote unquote I to a quote unquote you is in effect more essential than the communication technique. The innumerable and quite vain theories on the origin of language have in general accorded a lot more importance to the presumed occasions which were able to give birth to such and such a technique of expression. The truth is that language exists virtually from the very instant when two people face to face become conscious of being a personal quote unquote you and quote unquote I, or better, according to the ingenious theory of T.H. Mead of being interchangeable yous. Man himself is quickly set up to speak as to signify, want quote unquote to signify. And he can want, quote unquote, to signify as soon as he has seen in one of his fellows a conscious being. Incidentally, the intercommunication of two animals also exceeds the purely physical transmission of signals. They remain in the zone of psychobiology and instinct. They suppose instinctive knowledges and practices rather than consciousnesses grasping meanings, but they also suppose a passage in the transspatial world and cannot be reduced to the mechanical, quote, median part, unquote. Let us represent reality as a whole by the surface of a sphere and the conventional space-time on which classical physics claims to project all real phenomena, even those which are beyond space, to a cylinder tangent to the equator of the sphere. So there's a figure he refers to, which is, I would say, not that illuminating, but yeah, you can check it out for yourself. Okay. Contrary to the theses of the mystics and of certain phenomenologists, all informing communication necessarily touches the spatial-temporal equator through its median part, even if this is small. But a part of the quote-unquote trajectory of the communication necessarily passes through the meridian, quote-unquote meridian zones of the sphere and is only artificially projectable onto the cylinder. In the same way that an automaton cannot truly reason, but only mechanically carry out the quote-unquote combinatory of reasoning, it cannot truly transmit information. It cannot truly communicate, but only carry out the mechanical part of the transmission. But beyond the combinatory, there is the quote unquote noegenetic, which envelops it. Beyond the transmission of the pattern, there is the intention, quote unquote, to signify, the will to modify a consciousness. Communication is always, quote unquote, persuasive. It always has something, if not rhetorical, then at least axiological about it. Already all perception, whether human or animal, is a mix. In its physiological origins, it involves an aspect of purely mechanical or physical communication, which can probably always be reduced to a certain order of impact of photons. On the other hand, it is consciousness, or if one prefers, the apprehension of meaning or of beings in their signification. If instinctive or intelligent perception is already impossible to represent entirely on the equatorial line of the schema, this is even more so with the perception and comprehension of a language, because all authentic communication is a language. Language always implies an ensemble of mechanical and physiological media of communication functioning in the spatial-temporal plane, tangent to the equator, a quote-unquote horizontal trajectory. On the other hand, it implies two conscious centers, the emitter and the receiver, capable of expression and of comprehension. That is to say, capable of quote-unquote vertical, transphysical participation with a world of ideas, and capable of converting the ideas into structures and the structures into ideas. It also implies a code, more or less instantiated in habits or memories, psychological pathways or conventional channels, guiding the vertical participation and facilitating the invention inherent to expression or understanding. Cybernetics, which denies this vertical transphysical dimension, also, of course, denies the specifically psychological character of memory and code. It believes that all memory, considered as a simple stockage of structures, can be imitated by mechanical models, and that it does not have to be interpreted as dealing with some meaning. It believes that the mechanical models of memory permit us precisely to reject the very idea of a transphysical domain of meaning as a mystical and useless hypothesis, just as it considers the mechanical communication of structures not as auxiliary, but as the entirety of communication. It considers psychological memory not as the auxiliary of the vertical circulation along the transphysical dimension that we have defined, but as the whole of what in information appears to be added by the receiver to communicated structures. The meaning of information is the functioning that it controls. The meaning of a communication, according to a code, is the ensemble of stored structures that it unlocks, décroche. Cybernetics confuses a mere unlocking of materially recorded and stored information with the reminder of a mnemonic potential linked to a meaning that cannot exist in space. I'm just going to finish this section here. Electronic calculating machines have quote unquote memories capable of storing a great amount of information. Systems of electric valves, opening and closing, magnetic tapes, mercury tubes, and so on. These mechanical recorders are supposed to be true models of psychobiological memory, and the methods used to activate these memories, which depend on the machine's own assembly, are supposed to be close to our code. Thus, the quote mechanical memory unquote machines would be capable of correcting, printing, or spelling mistakes on the condition that they have a sufficient store of models of correctly written words, and also that the words to be corrected are not too badly spelled. The confusion of an unlocking and activation with a mnemonic reminder is clumsy. The mnemonic reminders provoked by the reception of a message have nothing in common with the utilization of information stored by a machine. They are indissociable from the recreation of a meaning, according to the intellectual capacity of the receiver. That is, according to whether he is connected with a world more or less rich in ideas and meanings, not more or less stocked with, quote, typographical cases, unquote. Okay, yeah, there's a lot going on in this bit. So this image of the sphere with the cylinder, I don't think that helpful. It's kind of hard to visualize. I think also the drawing here is maybe not quite right because he talks about the cylinder as being tangent to the sphere, but that's not what is shown in the drawing. So maybe to start with, we can talk about this question of animal communication. And so as Angus points out, there's some research on whether on this concept of theory of mind in non-human primates, also in some birds, corvids specifically. And so the question is, when these animals are interacting, so these are all social animals, so when they're interacting with conspecifics, are they just sort of treating each other as like complicated machines that, like, say one bird looks at the other bird and sort of tries to predict what sort of movements this important element of the environment is going to make, or is it sort of recognizing this other bird as a subject of some kind that has a perspective on the world that it will try to anticipate and adapt to. So there is some evidence that in the case of one study that I remember reading about is has to do with, I believe it's Western scrub jays. So these are a kind of corvid, and they will cache food. They dig holes in the ground and store the food there for later retrieval. And they are capable. So it's been documented that they are more likely to recache the food, so to dig it up and hide it somewhere else if they see another scrub jay watching them while they bury it. So it seems like one interpretation of what's going on is that they see themselves being observed, and they sort of attribute a knowledge of the location of the food to this other bird. And then, based on not wanting to have their food cache be raided, they, come back and recache it at another time to a location that the other bird doesn't know. Of course, any type of animal psychology studies are, it's very difficult to exclude other potential explanations. But it's at least plausible in these cases that these birds are attributing knowledge to other birds, and then trying to manipulate that knowledge, or to prevent those birds from being able to act on that knowledge. And this is also sort of related to psychology of human infants, because again, you have sort of the same difficulty when dealing with human infants as you do with non-human animals, that you can't just sort of ask them what they're doing, or give them instructions in the same way as you can with adult human subjects. Although, of course, in the case of adult human subjects, you don't necessarily want to take their explanations for granted as being correct, but you can at least get that information and then decide what to do with it. So one study, I think, are pretty famous, or there's many variations on this study, but with human infants, one of the sort of basic approaches to determining whether they recognize something is you give them a pacifier that has a sort of sensor in it that detects the rate at which they are sucking on the pacifier. And when something surprising happens, they start sucking faster. And then when things are just sort of normal or or going as expected, there's a slower rate. And so using this sort of criterion for determining whether the infant is seeing something as surprising or understands a situation as surprising, there's a sort of like false belief task that or like a scenario that is presented to the infant. So you have like a little puppet that comes into a room in a sort of puppet house, a doll house or whatever, and puts something in a box, a toy or whatever, and then leaves the room. And then a second puppet comes in and moves the toy to I don't know, a different, or takes it out of the, puts it in a different box or something like that. And then the first puppet comes back and then either looks where the toy was originally hidden, or where it has been moved to. And of course, for an adult human, we would like expect this first puppet to go back where it had hidden the toy in the first place, because it has a false belief that the toy is still there. And so the question is, is this what the infants are also expecting, or are they surprised when the puppet goes back to where it first hid the toy? And I think I think it turns out that like pretty early on, the infants are capable of sort of grasping that the puppet should go back to where it had first hidden the toy, even though the infant themselves knows that that's not where the toy is anymore. But yeah, so like doing different variations on this, like is the infant capable of attributing a false belief to this quasi agent, the puppet, in the same way that, like, say, the scrub jay is capable of attributing a belief to the other bird, seemingly in this experiment. So that's the kind of thing that you want to study when you're looking at different animals. Like, are they just sort of reacting to the signs that each of them gives off, or are they doing something like attributing a mental state, knowledge or belief or whatever, to this other animal?
Those are really interesting studies. Just to add to the list of theory of mind studies in animals, the study that I heard about recently is, I think it was chimpanzees, but experimental setup was such that there was this some highly desirable food and a container, which in one setup was visible to other chimpanzees other than the sort of test subject chimpanzee, including higher status, larger male chimpanzees, and one in which the desirable food was not visible to the higher status chimpanzees. When the chimpanzee that is being shown the food knows that the higher status chimpanzee can see it, it won't go after them. I guess doesn't want to risk a fight, or some other hierarchy related reason. But if it can see that the higher status chimpanzee cannot see it will go after it and try to get it. I guess presumably it's set up so that it could eat the food without being seen. And the conclusion that the researchers suggested was that the test subject chimpanzee knows when the other chimpanzees know whether the food is there or not.
Yeah, so that's a similar type of kind of test of like, yeah, is the sort of subject chimpanzee the one that you're interested in? Is it capable of attributing knowledge of the presence of this desirable food to the other potentially dangerous chimpanzees? Of course, with these kinds of studies, you can always sort of try to explain it in terms of like not a kind of attribution of knowledge, but like maybe the actual sort of observation of the gaze of the other chimpanzee is like the sort of direct stimulus to like or like a sort of inhibitory stimulus, that like perceiving the gaze of this larger or higher status chimpanzee has a sort of direct inhibitory effect on the behavior of the lower status chimpanzee, and there's no sort of detour through something like a theory of mind, or like an attribution of knowledge. And it's hard to, in general, it's hard to, sort of prove that that is not the case. Yeah, I think we talked about this when we were reading the Merleau-Ponty book, or maybe Simondon even. But like often when you set up an animal experiment, the animals are very clever at figuring out like signs that sort of map onto what you're trying to study, but are not actually, using the kind of sort of mental representation or whatever it is that you are interested in. That they'll like, maybe the way the experimenter walks is slightly different in like the two different setups that you're trying to test, to see whether the animal can distinguish, A from B, whatever those A and B are. Like the animal is sort of detecting the difference, not in the actual, things that you're presenting to them, but in the way that the experimenter is walking. And so you sort of do the study and go, oh yeah, animals can this, whatever the animal this is, they can distinguish A from B, but they're actually sort of keying on the experimenter and not on A and B. So yeah, the same as the dog example with the epilepsy, they are capable of detecting these very subtle signs and correlations between one subtle sign and some important event that happens later. So yeah, it could be just this sort of correlation. Every time or often when the higher status chimpanzee is looking at me, and I try to get food in that circumstance, then the higher status male attacks me. So this sort of correlation of patterns of events could be sort of what the chimpanzee is responding to, and not something like attribution of knowledge. So yeah, I don't know the specifics of that setup of that study, and maybe they take steps to try to rule out that possibility. But in general, that's the sort of like always the objection that comes up is like maybe this is explicable just in terms of some sort of less sophisticated, sort of less cognitively sophisticated, but more sort of perceptual learning type of explanation. Maybe that sort of correlation of observations is actually what's at work rather than this more sort of intellectual operation. But yeah, so I think like leaving aside the sort of specific difficulties of making these attributions, I think what Ruyer is getting at here is that even in the case, even if you think about like maybe less sophisticated forms of communication, you have like one of the sort of like stock examples in like philosophy of biology is I believe it's vervet monkeys that have like different alarm calls for different predators. Like so, there's one alarm call that they use when they spot an eagle flying overhead, and if that's the case, then you should like descend the tree and hide in the sort of undergrowth. And then there's a different call if there's I think a snake. And obviously in that situation, you don't want to descend into the undergrowth because that's like heading towards the snake. So you have a different response. So I think there's like three different alarm calls, that correspond to the presence of different predators and then different responses. And in this case, you have like a very like a relatively straightforward code. You don't have to, so like if you're a vervet monkey and you hear your fellow vervet monkey make one of these calls, you don't have to sort of analyze what whether the monkey what the monkey's state of mind is, whether they're telling the truth or not. So yeah, and as Angus points out, they do actually have a sort of differential degree of willingness to act on these calls depending on the sort of experience with the other monkeys. So like juveniles that maybe are more likely to make mistakes about what kind of predator is present will not be sort of afforded the same degree of reliability as others. So like if the juvenile makes the eagle alarm call, the others might not respond, might not go hide in the undergrowth. But when a more experienced adult makes the same call, then they will respond. But here it's not. You don't need to like. There doesn't seem to be any reason to like attribute propositional attitude attribution to these monkeys. That you don't have to say that the first monkey is sort of thinking to themselves in whatever sort of monkey thought form that like, oh, this is the juvenile, so I'm not going to believe them. It's just the sort of statistical correlation of reliability that like they recognize that this other monkey, this juvenile, is not reliable about making these alarm calls, and therefore they don't respond. And then the other adults are reliable, so they do respond. And so this is like in principle the same kind of process as the rat that learns to press a lever to get food. This pressing this lever is a reliable way of bringing about the presence of food. But I think what Ruyer would say is that there's still a kind of like, even in this sort of very simple sort of transmission, like you could express this situation in terms of just like, I guess, probably 2 bits of information. You have 3 options, so I mean 2 bits would be four options, but you would only need 2 bits of information to specify 3 different alarm calls. So it's and so like you could in principle replace one of these monkeys by an eagle detector and a snake detector or whatever the other one is, and then have like a speaker that plays the appropriate alarm call, and produce the same effect on the other monkeys as you would from a live monkey making the same determinations. But I think what Ruyer would say is that there's a kind of prior sort of biological orientation of these monkeys to values, and in this case, the value of not being eaten by a predator or not being attacked by a predator. So it's only because the monkeys, want to stay alive, in whatever. I mean, the monkeys are not, of course, thinking to themselves that life is good and I want to continue to live it. They're just sort of oriented towards the maintaining of their life process. But it's only because this prior orientation is there that the detection of the eagle call makes the monkey descend the tree and hide in the undergrowth. So even in this case, where it's like a very sort of, it is a quasi-mechanical signaling process where it's like one stimulus leads to one call, leads to one behavior. Even in this case, you still have to sort of presuppose this axiological orientation as like sort of the medium in which this signaling process occurs. Or to put it maybe in other ways, that if you took these like vervet monkey calls and you set up your vervet monkey detector in like a completely different forest where a completely different species of monkeys lives, and you just sort of play these vervet monkey calls, they probably would just ignore it. They would have no meaning for them. They would not like respond to the vervet monkey eagle call by hiding in the undergrowth. So maybe at some point they would learn that this weird call happens every time there's an eagle overhead, so maybe we should like respond to it. But they wouldn't have this sort of like immediate connection that like this call means hide in the undergrowth. So there's like, it's only by virtue of this this, I guess, existing orientation in axiological space that there would be this response. And then you could even imagine, suppose there's like some other creature that like hunts eagles, for example, that maybe the vervet monkey eagle call is like a sign that, that now that my prey is nearby, so I better climb up the tree and get ready to catch it. So here, like the alternate orientation of this organism would lead to a completely opposite response to the vervet monkey call. So this is sort of like an illustration of what he means by the fact that here you can treat the vervet monkey signaling system as a kind of mechanism or as a kind of machine, but that machine is always embedded in something non-mechanical, this axiological space. Before we go on, I just wanted to mention something that's kind of on the side, but in this section that we just read, he mentions some of the memory, the forms of electronic memory that existed at the time, and he mentions mercury tubes. And this is something I read about probably a couple of years ago now. But so in some of the early computers, the way that so the problem of memory is that you have as a device, you have an electronic computer, you have the device is on, you have electricity flowing through it, and then you turn it off, and then there's the electricity is not flowing through it anymore. So any states that were set up while the computer was on will disappear, and so you need to have some sort of persistent state that can be stored until you turn the computer on again. And for some of these early computers, you had like punch cards or paper tape or whatever it is that you had like some sort of so the tape, for example, you would like punch holes in the tape that would, and then you just like keep this roll of tape in your computer room, and then you'd feed it back into the computer when you want to restart whatever it is you were doing. One of these early memory systems was an actual like a tube full of mercury, and I don't know exactly how it works, but they would set up a wave in this mercury tube, like I guess it's essentially like a speaker that would just like produce a wave, in the mercury. And because mercury is so dense, like compared to air or water or whatever, this wave would just sort of reverberate in this mercury tube for, I don't know, a long time. And this was like your memory system was like a tube of mercury with a wave, bouncing back and forth within it, which is kind of cool. Okay, so we can read, I think, the next short section and then discuss that, and then stop there for the day. Angus, do you want to read Wells' Utopia?
Yeah. Wells' Utopia. In his utopian novel, Men Like Gods, H.G. Wells supposes that some English and French earthlings, having arrived on an unknown planet, listen to a speech by one of its inhabitants, who first explains what his function is. To their great surprise, each of the earthlings can understand as if the utopian speaks their native, but each is understood according to his culture and the level of intelligence. One has understood, quote, I study the action of nuclear fields on electrons, unquote, and another, quote, I weigh solid bodies, unquote. This utopia of Wells represents a philosophy of language that is better than Norbert Wiener's theory, and it is not very far from the facts. Language between people is often similar to a biological, quote-unquote, induction. The same chemical substance determines some very dissimilar things according to the embryonic areas or that is affected. It is similar to a sort of very general invitation to understand. We always try to find a meaning in the messages we receive to us to be obscure and everyone who is informed always informs themselves by themselves through reducible. Linguistic codes never precede an automatic correspondence with their pure state, and the invention codes inconceivable if a certain primary information cannot operate in almost immediate spirit without code and within a spatial. In the same way, the mechanical auxiliaries of inconceivable. When, as we say, we consult our own, the current quote-unquote I is not like a person goes to a closed register and decipher it. The quote-unquote I consults itself without an interposed means, or more probably, with some entirely psychological means. It is as if the line of communication, without descending, this time equator, nevertheless, passes by a more equatorial zone. The quote-unquote I does not have to understand how to read itself. Its memory supplies it almost directly with a meaning, conveyed sometimes by some auxiliary psychological means, but independently of all code and all deciphering. Between the current quote-unquote I and the mnemonic quote-unquote I, there is no dialogue, because even when the mnemonic effort is accompanied by an interior language, it is not the mnemonic quote-unquote I that speaks like an quote-unquote other, which we hear. It is the current quote-unquote I that interrogates itself in order to aid the quote-unquote telepathic effort of reunion of the current quote-unquote I and the mnemonic quote I, which were provisionally disjoined. In the mnemonic effort, like in the effort of where the quote-unquote I participates in a sort of quote universal I, the interior dialogue is certainly not essential and is often in fact absent, as experiments have demonstrated. Yet communication and information between two people, or even between two psychobiological individuals, is not as different to mnemonic auto-consultation as we would. Two living individuals participating in the same specific memory are not two absolutely distinct wholes. Otherwise, crossed reproduction or double heredity, paternal and maternal, would not be possible. Most importantly, two people participate in the same world of ideas, which is familiar to both, dialoguing a little like a man deliberating with himself or consulting in memory. They are a little like a mnemonic quote-unquote I for each other. The interposed mechanisms barely count. The point about the Wells novel kind of complicates the point he made earlier about the same sense communicated consciousnesses. It seems like even if it's the same idea can be greater or lesser detail or complexity depending on education, the recipient. And the point about a person consulting with their own and how it doesn't require material support. I don't know if I find that totally convincing. It seems I know he made the point earlier in the book that like mathematical calculus, we are in some neural mechanism, even if that's not the only thing that can be said to. But maybe he would admit that there is activity in the brain corresponding to this kind of mnemonic self-talk but that larger part of what is happening is idea, I guess, at the top of his sphere and not very close to the.
Yeah, maybe to start with the sort of H.G. Wells example here, I think in connection with his claim earlier that there's this identity of content when communication succeeds. I think maybe how we can try to reconcile these two positions is that even when there's misunderstanding, it's only misunderstanding insofar as it is misunderstanding of the same thing. So, like, if you're a math teacher trying to convey the Pythagorean theorem to your students, and they're not really getting what you're saying, they're still misunderstanding the Pythagorean theorem. It's still that unique ideal object, the Pythagorean theorem, that they're misunderstanding, even if their conception of what you're talking about is completely wrong or confused or whatever. So likewise, in the case, maybe that's a kind of trivial case where there's a kind of I guess correct reading of what the Pythagorean theorem is, and then there's a misunderstanding of it. But in the case of the H.G. Wells example, you have a sort of ideal semantic content that gets sort of filtered by each of the listeners into not only their own language, but their own sort of set of concepts that they are familiar with, that they can understand. And you can think of I don't know, literary text, for example, that different readers will get different things out of it, but there's still the Iliad is still one ideal entity, even if everyone who reads it is getting something different from it or understands it in a different sense. Although of course there's maybe it's more complicated as well, in the sense that there are different manuscripts of the Iliad, and maybe anyway, you can question that point as well. But I think that's sort of the idea here, that a text, a statement, whatever it is, has an ideal unity, and then different interpreters would sort of filter different that ideal unity would be filtered through the psychology of each of these different interpreters in different ways. On the question of memory, so I think when he says that there's no mechanism, I don't think it necessarily means that there's nothing sort of material going on here. So what I think the way that I would understand it is that if we compare memory to notes on a page, for example, he does a little bit earlier. So you can, if you're trying to remember someone's phone number, which most of us don't bother doing anymore, but you could keep it in your psychological memory, or you could write it down on a piece of paper, or in your phone or whatever. And the writing on a piece of paper is a kind of code. You have these specific shapes, corresponds to numbers, and you've sort of learned this code as a child, and you make use of this code to sort of go from your perception of the shapes on a page, and then extract or retrieve the number that corresponds to this shape. But if your biological memory or your psychological memory was something analogous to this code, then you would need something else to decipher the code from your memory. You'd have to, you have this whatever psychological memory representation that corresponds to the number 3, and then you would have to have something else that would extract the number 3 or retrieve the number 3 based on having received this memory representation that corresponds to it. But then the question, you get into a kind of an infinite regress problem here. If you can only, if memory consists of this kind of deciphering of a code, then the output of that process would again have to be deciphered. You would have to figure out what this output means, and decipher that, and so on. And it seems like we need something, if we are to make sense of memory as a grasping of this ideal structure of a content, of something semantic, then we need something that is not itself a code that it has to be deciphered, something that is a immediate grasp of that semantic content, rather than a representation of that semantic content in a code that has to be deciphered. So I think it's that. I think that's what he means. So like that immediate grasp of the semantic content might itself be performed by means of a brain and so on. Like as far as we know, only entities that have brains are capable of performing this kind of retrieval of a memory. But whatever it is, that memory retrieval process should not take the form of an encoding of something that has to be deciphered.
Yeah, I do not. I see your note about assimilating biological heredity, and this point is pretty mysterious to me. Two living individuals are not absolutely distinct, otherwise double heredity possible. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if he's saying that there's, two beings of the same species reproducing are accessing some kind of species memory, but it's pretty mysterious to me.
Yeah, he doesn't give us much to go on. It's just sort of one little sentence in the midst of this development here. But I guess so. How I would try to make sense of this is in relation to some of the like early embryology or early studies of development, and so like the sort of competing. Well, I'm leaving aside the sort of epigenetic approach, but like in the sort of two preformationist accounts, you would have either yeah, so if you start from a preformationist account, so you are taking it that the structure of the adult organism is already present in the embryo and just has to be sort of like expanded in a sort of crude way of putting it. If that's the case, then it seems like you have to take that structure to be either in the paternal or in the maternal contribution, because otherwise you are sort of, if you allow the paternal and maternal contributions to interact in some way, then you're sort of then more is going on than just sort of scaling up the pre-existing structure. So if it's the case that that development of an organism is essentially just the kind of scaling up, then you have to take that structure to be either in the paternal side or the maternal side. And yeah, so like there was this, homunculus account where you have like the sperm cell has a little person inside it, and that person has a little sperm cell inside them, and so on. There's like this, constant. There's like a continuous chain going all the way back to Adam of these like nested homunculi, and then of course the other side is that like there's the sort of maternal contribution. You would like trace everything back on the maternal side, and like in Aristotle's account of so he has a book on a generation of animals, for example. He treats the maternal contribution as well, at a first approximation, he treats the maternal contribution to be the material, and then the paternal contribution to be the form. But he does also, I believe it's in History of Animals, he talks about mules, which of course are hybrid, donkey horse hybrids. So in this case, you can't just sort of take the paternal contribution to be the form, because the mule has a different form than I forget which one is which in the mule generation process. But in any case, the donkey or the mule has a different form than either of its parents. So it has to somehow combine the contributions of the two parents to produce this hybrid form. And so I think what he is getting at here, this double heredity example, is that there has to be something common to the two parents if they can be sort of blended in the offspring. If there's heredity that descends on both sides, on the maternal and paternal sides, then you can't treat the paternal and maternal organisms as these sort of self-contained wholes that would be like that would have no windows in the sort of Leibnizian image, right? That you have to treat them as participating or being embedded in the same sort of axiological space or this sort of non-spatial realm, and each of them sort of contributing to the offspring, contributing their aspects to the offspring by virtue of that shared realm. I think that's what he's getting at, but yeah, because it's just one sentence, you have to sort of bring in a lot of external knowledge to get that out of that sentence. So I haven't read a lot of his other texts where he does talk about embryology and things like that. So it may some of those texts might sort of elucidate what he's talking about here. But yeah, that's how I would understand what he's saying here. Okay, yeah, so let's stop here for today and pick up from there next time. Let me just check. Okay, yeah, next week should work. The week after, I think I'll be out of town, but yeah, we can figure that out next week. Yeah, so next week should still be good. Okay. Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for participating, and